Hi guys. Imagine a man who stood in a crowded town square and publicly burned the most sacred medical textbooks of his time, screaming that the smoke from those burning pages held more truth than all the university professors combined. A man who claimed he could make gold but chose to cure the poor instead. We're diving into the chaotic, brilliant and controversial life of Paracelsus, the rebel alchemist who smashed the idols of ancient medicine to build the foundations of modern science, and trust me, his life was wilder than any fiction. But before we begin, for those who enjoy slow, thoughtful stories about legendary figures, hit like, subscribe and share in the comments which personality or historical figure you'd like me to cover next, and tell me, where are you watching from? I'm always curious to see the different places my viewers are from. Born in the bitter winter of 1493 near the Devil's Bridge in the Swiss canton of Schwyz, his birth name was a mouthful: Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, a name that sounds as explosive as his personality would turn out to be, though later he would adopt the moniker Paracelsus, meaning beyond Celsus, effectively telling the world he was superior to the famous Roman medical authority of the past. He entered the world at a turning point in history, right on the edge of the Renaissance, a time when the printing press was new and Columbus had just sailed to the Americas, yet medicine was still stuck in the Dark Ages, ruled by the ghost of Galen, an ancient Greek physician whose theories hadn't been challenged for over 1,000 years. Theophrastus was the son of Wilhelm von Hohenheim, an impoverished doctor and the illegitimate son of a Swabian nobleman, and a mother who was likely a bondservant from the local abbey. Tragedy struck early when his mother, who suffered from severe mood swings and possibly what we would now call manic depression, died when he was just a child, leaving him to be raised by his father, who became his first and most important teacher. Wilhelm didn't force the boy to memorize dusty scrolls, but instead took him out into the Swiss wilderness, teaching him that every plant, every root and every stone had a spirit and a purpose, instilling in him the belief that God had placed a remedy for every illness somewhere in nature, waiting to be found. When Theophrastus was 9, they moved to Villach in Austria, a rough mining town where the air smelled of sulphur and the economy revolved around digging metals from the earth. And this relocation changed everything, because it wasn't a university classroom that sparked his genius, but the smelting vats and the dark tunnels of the Fugger mines. Here, young Paracelsus didn't hang out with scholars. He spent his time with miners, smelters and metal workers, watching how ores were transformed by fire, learning about the toxicity of metals like arsenic and mercury, and observing the strange lung diseases that plagued the workers, observations that would later lead him to found the field of occupational medicine. He was fascinated by the alchemical processes he saw, the idea that fire could purify and change matter, and he began to wonder if the same principles could be applied to the human body, effectively planting the seeds for iatrochemistry, or chemical medicine. At 16, he started his university studies, likely at the University of Basel. But the experience was a disaster for a mind like his because he despised the teaching method, which consisted entirely of reciting ancient texts without ever looking at a patient or questioning if the texts were actually true. He famously mocked the professors, calling them sophists who knew nothing of reality, and soon he dropped out or was kicked out, realizing that the schools of man could teach him nothing compared to the school of nature. He then began his Wanderjahre, his years of wandering, a journey that would take him across the known world from the universities of Italy to the battlefields of the Netherlands, and perhaps as far as Russia and the Middle East. During these travels, he didn't seek out other doctors. Instead, he learned from the low life of society: executioners, barbers, shepherds, gypsies, and midwives, collecting folk remedies and practical surgical techniques that the elites ignored. He served as an army surgeon during the Venetian Wars, where he made a radical discovery that went against all medical advice of the time. Instead of pouring boiling oil onto gunshot wounds to cauterize them, which caused agony and infection, he treated them with clean balms and let nature heal them, observing that if you prevent infection, nature will heal the wound all by herself. This was heresy in a world where doctors believed pus was a sign of healing, But Paracelsus didn't care about heresy. He cared about results. He dove deep into the study of alchemy, but not for the greed of making gold like so many charlatans of his age. His goal was the elixir of life and the panacea, universal cures that could alleviate human suffering. He studied under the mysterious abbot Johannes Trithemius, a master of cryptography and magic, delving into the occult and the hermetic arts, convinced that a true doctor must understand the stars, the earth, and the divine spark within man. By the time he was 30, he was a walking encyclopedia of forbidden knowledge, a rough-talking, sword-carrying physician who looked more like a bandit than a doctor, ready to unleash his chemical revolution on a stagnant world. After years of wandering the muddy roads of Europe and absorbing the hidden knowledge of the common folk, Paracelsus emerged in 1526 in the city of Strasbourg, attempting to settle down as a respectable citizen, but destiny had a much more explosive path in store for him. His reputation as a miracle worker began to spread like wildfire when he was summoned to Basel to treat the famous publisher Johannes Frobenius, a man who was the Steve Jobs of the printing world at that time and a close friend of the legendary humanist Erasmus of Rotterdam. Frobenius was suffering from a severe infection in his right leg, a necrotic condition that caused him agonizing pain, and the leading doctors of the city, having exhausted their useless catalogue of bloodletting and herbal poultices, saw no other option but immediate amputation to save his life. Paracelsus arrived not with a sore, but with his chemical tinctures and balsams, likely containing opium which he called laudanum, and within a short time he not only saved the leg but had Frobenius up and walking, a feat that seemed practically magical to the onlookers, and instantly catapulted the rough-edged alchemist into the higher circles of European intellect. Erasmus himself wrote to Paracelsus, marvelling at his skill, and this high-profile success led to the City Council of Basel appointing him as the municipal physician and a professor at the University of Basel, a position of immense prestige that usually required years of political manoeuvring. However, if the establishment thought they were hiring a docile academic, they were dead wrong. Paracelsus treated his appointment as a declaration of war against the medical status quo. On his very first day, he posted a manifesto on the university doors that was dripping with arrogance and revolutionary zeal, declaring that he would not teach the dusty theories of the ancients, but would only teach what he had learned through his own experience in the light of nature. When classes began, the scandal was immediate and absolute, because instead of wearing the traditional crimson robe and square cap of a doctor, Paracelsus walked into the lecture hall wearing his dirty alchemist's leather apron, looking like a common labourer, and even worse, he began to speak in Swiss German, the language of the street, instead of the academic Latin that was used to keep knowledge exclusive to the elite. This was a radical act of democratization, effectively inviting the barber surgeons and students who didn't know Latin to understand medicine, breaking the gatekeeping of the university hierarchy. He proceeded to tear apart the foundational theory of the time, the Galenic theory of the four humours, which stated that health was just a balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile. Paracelsus argued that the body was a chemical system, a microcosm of the universe, and introduced his own tria prima theory, stating that everything is composed of mercury, fluidity and intellect, sulphur, flammability and soul, and salt, solidity and body. The tension reached its boiling point on St. John's Eve in 1527, during the traditional midsummer bonfire in the town square, where students and faculty gathered for celebration. In a moment of pure theatrical rebellion, Paracelsus marched to the fire carrying a heavy book, likely the Canon of Medicine by Avicenna, which was considered the medical Bible of the era, and hurled it into the flames, shouting to the horrified crowd that "Your Galen, your Avicenna, and all your scribblers know less than my shoelaces." This wasn't just book burning, it was a symbolic execution of the old authority, a statement that the past must die for the future of science to live, and while the students cheered this rock star behaviour, the faculty and the established doctors began to plot his destruction. They didn't have to wait long, because Paracelsus, lacking any political tact, got into a nasty legal dispute with a wealthy canon named Cornelius von Lichtenfels, whom Paracelsus had cured of stomach pains after the man promised a huge fee of 100 florins. Once cured, the canon refused to pay, offering only 6 florins, and the corrupt judges sided with the rich churchman. Enraged, Paracelsus wrote pamphlets insulting the judges and the clergy, calling them names that would make a sailor blush, and faced with arrest for contempt of court, the man who had just saved the city's most famous publisher was forced to flee Basel in the dead of night, once again a homeless wanderer, leaving behind a legacy of brilliance and burnt bridges. Now an outcast again, Paracelsus stumbled into the town of Colmar, humiliated but with his spirit unbroken, and his anger had only sharpened his pen, leading him to write furiously, producing manuscript after manuscript that would eventually change the world, though getting them published proved to be a nightmare because the medical establishment he had insulted in Basel now had a target on his back and actively pressured city councils to ban his books. It was during these years of frustration and poverty that he tackled the greatest health crisis of the 16th century, the terrifying outbreak of syphilis, known then as the French disease, which was ravaging Europe with horrific symptoms that regular doctors were powerless to stop, leaving victims with disfigured faces and decaying bodies. The standard treatment approved by the rich and powerful was guaiacum wood, an exotic import from the Americas that was incredibly expensive and controlled by the powerful Fugger banking family who had a monopoly on the trade, making it essentially the first big pharma scam in history, because the wood did absolutely nothing to cure the disease, acting only as a mild laxative while draining the patient's wallets. Paracelsus, noticing that the rich were getting poorer and the sick were staying sick, launched a savage attack on the guaiacum trade, writing essays that exposed the uselessness of the wood and accusing the doctors of being shills for the merchants, a move that made him even more enemies among the wealthy elite who profited from the suffering of the masses. Instead of imported wood, Paracelsus looked to heavy metals, specifically mercury, which had been used carelessly before and often killed the patient faster than the disease because doctors didn't understand toxicity. This is where Paracelsus dropped one of the most important principles in the history of science, the concept that gave birth to modern toxicology. All things are poison, and nothing is without poison. The dosage alone makes it so a thing is not a poison. He realized that mercury could kill or cure depending entirely on how it was prepared chemically and how much was given, so he developed safe, carefully measured mercury compounds that actually halted the syphilis bacteria, saving countless lives and proving that chemistry was superior to vague theories about humours. During this period, he lived a life that would kill a normal man, often sleeping in ditches or cheap inns, always wearing his sword, which he called Azoth, and rumour had it that the pommel of the sword contained a captive demon, or the Elixir of Life, though it was likely just his emergency supply of laudanum pills, which he popped like candy. He was known to challenge local doctors to drinking contests in taverns, consuming massive amounts of wine yet still being able to dictate his brilliant treatises to his assistants late into the night without slurring a word, driven by a manic energy to record his knowledge before he died. He finally managed to publish his masterpiece De Grossen Wundarzney, or The Great Surgery Book, which somehow got past the censors and became a bestseller, earning him a brief moment of financial stability and fame, though he spent it all on laboratory equipment and travel expenses almost immediately. In this book he argued that disease was not an internal imbalance of fluids as Galen had taught, but was caused by external agents, seeds of disease that invaded the body from the outside, a frighteningly accurate prediction of the germ theory that wouldn't be proven for another 350 years. He saw the body as a chemical laboratory, and the doctor as the alchemist who must fix the broken reactions, famously stating that a doctor must be a traveller, knowledge is experience, essentially telling the armchair academics that truth is found in the mud of the world, not in the comfort of a library, and that nature herself was the only textbook worth reading. While Paracelsus was busy revolutionising surgery and toxicology, he was simultaneously diving headfirst into the darkest corners of the human mind, becoming arguably the first psychiatrist in history, at a time when mental illness was universally dismissed as demonic possession or witchcraft. In the early 16th century, if you heard voices or suffered from seizures, the prescription was usually an exorcism or a burning stake. But Paracelsus looked at the possessed and saw patients, not sinners. He famously wrote about the diseases that deprive man of his reason, classifying mental disorders into categories that sound surprisingly modern, such as lunatici for those whose minds were affected by the phases of the moon, and insani for those born with genetic defects, boldly stating that mental diseases have nothing to do with evil spirits or devils. Nature proves that such statements by priests are false. He tackled the phenomenon of the dancing plague, or St. Vitus's dance, where hundreds of people would dance uncontrollably until they died of exhaustion, and while the church screamed about curses, Paracelsus diagnosed it as chorea lasciva, a condition caused by the imagination and sexual frustration, suggesting cool water and isolation as a cure rather than prayer. But for all his scientific foresight, Paracelsus was still a man of the Renaissance, deeply entrenched in the bizarre world of high alchemy, and nowhere is this clearer than in his infamous recipe for the homunculus, a tiny artificial human being created in a test tube. In his book De Natura Rerum, he gives actual instructions that would make a modern biologist faint, claiming that if you take human sperm, seal it in a glass vessel, and bury it in horse manure for 40 days to provide the necessary heat for putrefaction, it would begin to move and take form. He wrote that after this period, it would look like a transparent man without a body, and if fed with human blood for 40 weeks, it would grow into a living, thinking child, possessing all the knowledge of the universe but much smaller than a natural-born human. This sounds like pure madness to us, a scene straight out of Frankenstein, but for Paracelsus, it was the ultimate proof of man's power over nature, the belief that humanity could mimic the divine act of creation through the mastery of chemistry. This obsession with the connection between the universe and the body was the core of his philosophy known as above so below, or the microcosm-macrocosm theory. He believed that the human body, the microcosm, was a perfect miniature replica of the universe, the macrocosm, containing within it all the stars, planets, and minerals found in the heavens and earth. To Paracelsus, the heart was the sun of the body, pumping heat and life. The brain was the moon, cool and reflective. The liver was Jupiter, and the gallbladder was Mars, representing anger and fire. This wasn't just poetic metaphor, it was his medical roadmap, meaning that to treat a disease of the heart, one needed a medicine possessing the qualities of the sun, like gold, and to treat the brain, one used silver, the metal of the moon. He argued that a doctor who doesn't understand astronomy is a charlatan because the physician should know what is in the heaven and what is in the earth, not what is in the books, effectively turning medicine into a cosmic science, where the alignment of the stars and the minerals in the ground were intimately linked to the patient's pulse. Despite these grand theories, his daily life was a chaotic mess of writing and wandering. His one-time assistant, Johannes Aporinus, who would later become a famous printer, described living with Paracelsus as a terrifying experience, claiming the alchemist would often wake up in the middle of the night screaming, smashing the furniture with his sword, as if fighting invisible ghosts, and that he was so consumed by his work that he would go days without changing his clothes, dictating his books in a frenzy, while foaming at the mouth with passion. Operinus eventually left him, unable to handle the intensity, and later spread nasty rumours about Paracelsus being a drunkard and a madman, rumours that Paracelsus's enemies were all too happy to print, further ruining his reputation. Yet, even as he was mocked by the elites, Paracelsus continued to dig into the mysteries of the archeus, the internal alchemist he believed lived in the stomach, a spiritual force that separated the useful nutrients from the waste in our food, a primitive but brilliant intuition about the existence of enzymes and gastric juices long before they were discovered. One of the most poetic yet practical concepts Paracelsus introduced to the world was the doctrine of signatures, a theory that perfectly bridges the gap between medieval mysticism and observational science. based on the idea that God didn't just dump plants on the earth randomly, but actually labelled them for human use. Paracelsus believed that the physical appearance of a plant, its shape, colour or texture, was a divine signature indicating what part of the human body it was meant to cure. For instance, he pointed out that the walnut looks exactly like a human brain, with a hard outer shell representing the skull and the convoluted kernel inside resembling the brain hemispheres. Therefore, he argued, it must be good for headaches and mental clarity. A primitive logic that curiously aligns with modern findings about fatty acids in nuts being good for brain health. He looked at the euphrasia flower, which has markings that look like a human eye, and prescribed it for eye infections, and he observed that the roots of orchids looked like testicles, suggesting they could cure reproductive issues. While this sounds like superstition to us, it forced doctors to actually look at nature closely, to catalogue plants based on their physical properties rather than just memorising ancient Greek lists. But Paracelsus wasn't just a botanist. He was a hardcore chemist who is credited with naming the metal zinc, calling it that because the crystals looked like zinca, or teeth, spikes, making him the first person to categorise it as a distinct element separate from other metals. His laboratory was a place of constant explosion and experimentation, where he developed the specific preparation of laudanum, a tincture of opium that became the standard painkiller for the next 400 years. Before Paracelsus, pain management was brutal, often consisting of biting on a leather strap or getting the patient drunk. But Paracelsus believed that pain was a disease in itself that needed to be treated, creating his secret stones of immortality, which were essentially solidified opium pills that he could dissolve in wine to bring immediate relief to suffering patients. This miracle drug was so effective that he reportedly brought patients back from the brink of death, simply by stopping their agony and allowing their bodies to rest, further fueling the rumours that he was a sorcerer. However, his genius in medicine was matched by his turbulence in religion. He lived during the height of the Protestant Reformation, and while he sympathised with Martin Luther's attack on the corruption of the Catholic Church, he ultimately rejected Luther too, famously saying Luther is just another pope, which managed to alienate him from both sides of the religious war. He wrote volumes of theological texts, arguably more than he wrote on medicine, preaching a version of Christianity that was deeply personal, socialist and anti-authoritarian, believing that the only true church was the community of all believers, and that immense wealth was a barrier to salvation. He walked the Alpine roads, preaching to the poor, predicting the end of the world, and interpreting the Bible with the same radical independence he applied to medicine, which made him a target for the Inquisition and local magistrates alike. Because of his refusal to pick a side, he was often chased out of towns, forced to leave his equipment behind, and at one point in the city of Innsbruck he was so destitute and ragged that the burgomaster refused to let him enter the city, judging him by his tattered coat rather than his brilliant mind. This rejection stung him deeply, leading him to write bitter essays about how the world loves fools in velvet, while despising truth in rags, reinforcing his identity as the lone wolf of science, the misunderstood genius who walked a path that no one else dared to follow. He began to see himself as a martyr for the truth, convinced that future generations would understand what his contemporaries could not, and he doubled down on his chemical philosophy, asserting that the true physician is born of God, not of the university, and that the light of nature was the second revelation of God, equal in importance to the Bible itself. In 1531, Paracelsus found a brief moment of peace in the Swiss town of St. Gallen, where he poured his chaotic genius into what is arguably his most important theoretical work, the Opus Paramerum, a book that completely rewrote the map of human health by abandoning the single-cause theories of the past and proposing that disease stems from 5 distinct spheres, or entia. This was a groundbreaking classification that showed just how far ahead of his time he really was. He listed the ens astrale, environmental and cosmic influences, the ens veneni, poisons and diet, the ens naturale, our genetic constitution, the ens spirituale, psychological factors, and finally the ens dei, the will of God or karma. but it was his exploration of the ons veneni that truly revolutionized medicine, as he introduced the concept of tartar, a term he borrowed from the winemaking industry. He observed that just as wine leaves a hard, crusty deposit called tartar on the inside of a barrel as it ferments, the human body accumulates metabolic waste and toxins from the food we eat if our internal digestion isn't working perfectly. He argued that when the archeus, that internal alchemist in our stomach, fails to separate the pure from the impure, this tartar builds up in the joints, muscles and organs, calcifying over time and causing excruciating pain. This was the first time anyone had accurately described the chemical mechanism behind diseases like gout, arthritis, and kidney stones, effectively identifying them as metabolic disorders rather than mysterious imbalances of humours. While the doctors of his day were treating gout with useless laxatives and bloodletting, Paracelsus told his patients the hard truth. Their pain was a result of their lifestyle, a chemical sludge accumulating in their bodies because of rich foods and poor digestion. He famously declared, "The doctor does not make the health, the body does," shifting the focus to the body's own ability to detoxify and heal, provided it isn't overwhelmed by this tartaric sludge. This theory of tartar was a direct attack on the gluttonous lifestyle of the nobility and the rich merchants, the very people who could afford his services but whom he despised for their excess, telling them that their swollen feet and aching joints were the physical manifestation of their greed. He didn't just diagnose, he sought solvents in his laboratory, chemical substances that could dissolve this hardened tartar in the body, just as acids dissolve limestone, moving medicine away from passive herbal teas toward active chemical intervention. During this time, he also turned his attention to the matrix, his term for the female reproductive system, and while his views were coloured by the sexism of the 16th century, he was one of the few male doctors who actually took women's diseases seriously, arguing that women had a distinct physiology that required different treatments than men, criticising his colleagues for treating women as merely imperfect men. He spent hours talking to midwives, whom he respected more than university-trained obstetricians, learning the secrets of childbirth and female anatomy that were ignored by the establishment. However, his restless spirit and the constant friction with local authorities meant he couldn't stay in St. Gallen forever. His radical theology and his refusal to attend Mass made him a suspect figure once again. As he packed his bags to move on, continuing his eternal pilgrimage, he left behind manuscripts that were messy, written in a mix of Latin and German slang, and full of made-up words, but which contained the seeds of modern rheumatology and metabolic science. He was a man running out of time, aging prematurely, his body worn down by exposure to toxic fumes in his lab and the harsh weather of the road, yet his mind was accelerating, racing to decode the secrets of the universe before the end came. He began to speak more of the light of nature as a Holy Spirit, a divine guide that was accessible to anyone, rich or poor, who had the eyes to see, further distancing himself from the church which claimed to be the only path to truth. He was becoming more than a doctor. He was evolving into a mystical philosopher, a sage of the streets who believed that the ultimate medicine was love, love for the patient and love for the art of healing, stating, "Where there is no love, there is no art," a motto that would echo through the centuries as the moral compass of the medical profession. In the early 1530s, Paracelsus turned his back on the cities that had rejected him and returned to the source of his first inspiration, the rugged mountains and the dark, suffocating tunnels of the mines, a journey that would lead to one of the most significant milestones in the history of medicine. While most doctors of his era wouldn't be caught dead talking to a dirty labourer, Paracelsus practically moved in with the miners of the Fuga properties in Carinthia and the Inn Valley, witnessing first-hand the brutal conditions they endured. He noticed that these men, often in the prime of their youth, were dying at an alarming rate from a mysterious wasting disease that stripped the breath from their lungs, a condition that local superstition attributed to the Bergmennlein, or mountain spirits, vindictive gnomes who supposedly punished those who stole treasure from the earth. Paracelsus, with his characteristic disdain for superstition when a scientific answer was available, looked at the lungs of the dead and saw not the work of demons, but the work of dust and toxic vapours, leading him to write on the miner's sickness and other diseases of miners, the very first book in history dedicated solely to occupational health. He correctly identified that the Bergsucht, miner's sickness, was caused by inhaling the metallic vapours of mercury and arsenic, as well as the constant intake of rock dust, distinguishing for the first time between tuberculosis, an infection, and silicosis, an environmental injury. A distinction that saved countless lives by shifting the focus from prayer to ventilation. He railed against the greed of the mine owners, arguing that they had a moral obligation to protect their workers, suggesting safety measures like better airflow and shorter shifts, effectively becoming the first advocate for workers' compensation and industrial safety regulations centuries before the Industrial Revolution. During this period, he also became obsessed with the healing power of water, travelling to the thermal baths of Bad Pfeffers, a terrifying place located in a deep, narrow gorge where the sun barely reached the bottom, and patients were lowered down on ropes like supplies. Instead of just trusting the local legends, Paracelsus conducted a chemical analysis of the water, tasting it, boiling it, and examining the sediment, concluding that its healing properties came from dissolved minerals like sulphur and limestone that acted on the body's chemistry. He wrote a treatise on thermal baths that laid the groundwork for modern balneology, the study of therapeutic bathing, arguing that the earth itself was a pharmacy, and that these springs were nature's own liquid medicine. Despite these intellectual triumphs, his personal life was hitting rock bottom. He was wandering through the alpine snows, often looking like a beggar, his clothes stained with chemicals and travel mud, leading many to dismiss him as a vagrant. Yet, it was in this state of destitution that he penned his Archidoxis, a book attempting to unify all his chemical knowledge into a grand system, where he introduced the concept of the quintessence. He believed that every substance on Earth contained a hidden core of power, a concentrated essence that embodied its true nature, and the job of the alchemist was to strip away the gross, physical matter to reveal this quintessence. For example, he argued that the quintessence of fire was not the flame itself, but the heat that transforms, and the quintessence of a plant was the specific chemical alkaloid that cured disease, not the whole leaf or root. This search for the active ingredient is the fundamental principle of modern pharmacology. Every time you take an aspirin instead of chewing on willow bark, you are benefiting from Paracelsus's obsession with extracting the quintessence. He was trying to separate the pure from the impure, both in his beakers and in his soul, becoming increasingly spiritual and convinced that he was a prophet of a new age. He began to compare the alchemist to God, saying that just as God created the world from chaos, the alchemist creates order from matter, a heretical view that made him feel like a god-man walking among mortals. He was lonely, brilliant, and arguably manic, talking to stones and stars because the people around him could not comprehend the revolution he was carrying in his satchel, a revolution that would eventually turn the black magic of the Middle Ages into the bright science of the future. By 1536, Paracelsus arrived in the city of Augsburg, looking older than his 43 years, his face weathered by the sun and his hands stained with acids. But he was about to achieve the one thing that had eluded him his entire life, a bestseller that would force the world to listen. The publication of Die Grosse Wundarzney, the Great Surgery book, was the turning point that finally made the medical establishment acknowledge him, not because they liked him, they still hated his guts, but because the public demanded his knowledge. This book wasn't just a manual, it was a revolution printed on paper, written in clear, aggressive German that any barber surgeon could read, bypassing the Latin gatekeepers and offering practical solutions for gunshot wounds, ulcers, and broken bones that actually worked. But Paracelsus being Paracelsus, he couldn't just stick to stitching wounds. He had to include some of the most bizarre and mind-bending theories of the era, most notably the infamous weapon salve. This was sympathetic magic at its peak, where Paracelsus claimed that if you were stabbed, you shouldn't just treat the wound, but you should treat the sword that stabbed you. He prescribed a special ointment made of moss grown on a skull, human blood and mummy dust, which was to be applied to the weapon while the wound itself was just washed with clean water and wrapped in clean linen. Now, here is the plot twist that makes him a genius by accident. The weapon salve actually worked better than standard medical treatment of the time, not because of the magic on the sword, but because it stopped doctors from stuffing dirty cow dung-based ointments into the open wound, effectively quarantining the doctor's interference and allowing the body to heal naturally without infection. It was a placebo for the physician, ensuring they did no harm while nature did the heavy lifting, a perfect example of his less is more philosophy masked as sorcery. This fascination with the morbid led him to the concept of mumia, a medicinal ingredient that was exactly what it sounds like: parts of corpses. In the 16th century, mumia was a craze, but Paracelsus gave it a specific alchemical twist, believing that the vital life force of a person remained in their flesh for a short time after death, especially if they died suddenly or violently while in perfect health. He theorized that by ingesting this spiritual extract of a healthy but dead person, the sick could absorb their vitality, a vampiric concept that blurs the line between medicine and necromancy. Yet it was grounded in his desperate search to transfer life energy from one vessel to another. As his fame grew, so did the target on his back. But in 1540 he received a surprising invitation from Prince Archbishop Duke Ernst of Bavaria to come to Salzburg and settle down. It seemed like the happy ending he deserved, a final sanctuary where he could organize his chaotic writings and rest his weary bones under the protection of a powerful patron. He took a room at the White Horse Inn, but his time in Salzburg would be tragically short. On September 21st, 1541, Paracelsus dictated his last will and testament, not from a university chair surrounded by students, but from a small room, likely dying of toxicity from years of handling heavy metals like mercury and antimony, or perhaps from a stroke brought on by a lifetime of stress and alcohol. However, darker rumours persist to this day that he was murdered by agents of the jealous medical guild, ambushed by thugs hired by doctors who lost business to his cures, and thrown down a steep embankment or cliff, leading to a skull fracture that proved fatal. Modern forensic analysis of his skull actually revealed a crack that could support this theory of violence, adding a final note of conspiracy to a life defined by conflict. He left his few meagre possessions to the poor, true to his Christian socialist roots, and was buried in the cemetery of St. Sebastian in Salzburg, where his tomb became a pilgrimage site for the sick who believed that just touching his gravestone could cure the incurable, proving that in death he had become the very saint of medicine that he was denied being in life. Even as his body turned to dust, his ghost began to haunt the laboratories of Europe. Because while Paracelsus the man was gone, Paracelsianism was just being born, ready to explode into a scientific war that would last for a century, pitting the chemical doctors against the Galenic traditionalists in a battle for the soul of Western medicine. When Paracelsus died in 1541, the medical establishment let out a collective sigh of relief, thinking the mad dog of medicine was finally silenced, and that they could go back to their comfortable routine of reciting ancient Greek poetry, while their patients died of simple infections. But they were dead wrong, because Paracelsus was about to pull off his greatest trick from beyond the grave. For about 20 years, his name faded into a whisper, known only to a small circle of loyal disciples who guarded his tattered manuscripts like holy relics. But then, starting in the 1560s, a massive explosion of publishing occurred that historians now call the Paracelsian Revival, a phenomenon that hit Europe with the force of a tsunami. It turned out that during his wandering life, Paracelsus had left trails of paper in every inn, castle and laboratory he visited, and dedicated followers like Adam von Bodenstein and Johannes Huser began a treasure hunt across the continent to collect, translate, and publish these lost works, unleashing a flood of radical ideas that had been suppressed for decades. Suddenly, the universities that had mocked him were being besieged by students demanding to learn chymiatria, or chemical medicine, forcing the academic elite into a defensive war that would tear the medical world apart for the next century. This was the era of the medical wars, a brutal intellectual conflict where you were either a Galenist, clinging to the old herbal traditions and the four humours, or a Paracelsian, embracing the new power of minerals, chemistry and experimentation. The epicentre of this battle was the University of Paris, the fortress of conservatism, where the faculty declared Paracelsus a heretic, a drunkard and a sorcerer, officially banning the use of antimony and other metallic medicines in 1566, making it a crime to prescribe the very cures that were saving lives elsewhere. But the results spoke louder than the laws. While the Parisian doctors were losing patients to the plague, Paracelsian doctors were using antimony, a toxic metalloid that causes violent vomiting but also sweats out toxins, to successfully treat fevers and infections, earning them the trust of kings and armies. This specific conflict, known as the Antimony War, became the symbol of the new science fighting the old dogma, with the chemical doctors arguing that desperate diseases required desperate cures, famously stating that a soft broom cannot sweep a rough floor. It was during this time that the legend of Paracelsus began to mutate into something mythical, blurring the line between history and folklore. People began to whisper that he was the inspiration for the character of Dr. Faustus, the man who sold his soul to the devil for knowledge, a rumour fuelled by his mysterious sword Azoth and his uncanny ability to cure the incurable. Yet, beneath the mythology, a profound shift was happening in the actual practice of science. The alchemical laboratories that used to be hidden in cellars were moving into the mainstream, evolving into the first pharmacies. Before Paracelsus, an apothecary was just a storehouse for dried herbs. After him, it became a chemical manufacturing plant where distillation, sublimation, and extraction were daily activities, changing the very smell of medicine from dusty leaves to acrid sulphur. This was the birth of the pharmaceutical industry as we know it, founded on the Paracelsian principle that we can manipulate matter to create synthetic cures that do not exist in nature. His followers, the Paracelsians, became the punk rockers of the Renaissance, wearing their exclusion from universities as a badge of honour, setting up their own networks and publishing houses, and effectively creating a parallel scientific community that was open to experimentation and rejected the authority of the ancients. They argued that God had written two books, the Bible and the Book of Nature, and while the priests interpreted the first, it was the duty of the chemical physician to interpret the second, making science a holy vocation. This religious zeal is what gave the movement its staying power. They weren't just arguing about pills, they were arguing about the structure of the universe and man's place in it, believing that by unlocking the secrets of chemistry, they were getting closer to the mind of God. The chemical philosophy began to replace the Aristotelian worldview, suggesting that the universe wasn't static but was in a constant state of alchemical transformation, a dynamic process of separation and purification that mirrored the life of a Christian soul. As the Paracelsian Wars raged across Europe, a new breed of scientist emerged from the smoke of the battlefield known as the iatrochemists, literally meaning doctor chemists, who took Paracelsus's wild ramblings and started organising them into a coherent system that would eventually become modern chemistry. The biggest rock star of this second wave was the Flemish nobleman Jan Baptist van Helmont, a man often called the Flemish Paracelsus, who was a genius in his own right and took the Swiss doctor's theories to the next level. Van Helmont was fascinated by Paracelsus's concept of chaos, the primal, shapeless matter from which the universe was formed, and while experimenting in his lab with burning wood and charcoal, he observed a strange, invisible substance that was distinct from normal air. He needed a name for this wild spirit that couldn't be contained in a vessel, so he took the word chaos and phonetically tweaked it into a new word, gas. Yes, the word gas that we use every day for everything from neon signs to fueling our cars comes directly from a Paracelsian alchemist trying to describe the invisible ghosts of matter, proving just how deeply his language is embedded in our reality. Van Helmont proved that air wasn't just a single simple element as the ancients believed, but a mixture of different gases, a massive leap forward that wouldn't have happened without the Paracelsian push to analyse the chemical breakdown of the world. But the influence of our rebel doctor didn't stop at chemistry. It reached the very top of the intellectual food chain, touching minds you would never associate with alchemy. You might be shocked to learn that Sir Isaac Newton, the hyper-rational father of gravity and calculus, was secretly obsessed with Paracelsus and spent decades studying his works. When Newton's hair was analysed centuries later, it was found to contain massive amounts of mercury, likely because he spent sleepless nights in his private Cambridge lab trying to replicate Paracelsus's recipes for the Philosopher's Stone and the Alchemist, the universal solvent. Newton wrote over 1 million words on alchemy, far more than he wrote on physics or math, believing that Paracelsus held the key to an ancient prisca sapientia, pristine wisdom, that explained how God actively intervened in the physical world. This secret lineage connects the mad Swiss doctor directly to the peak of the Enlightenment, proving that the separation between magic and science was a lot thinner than your high school textbooks admit. Paracelsus effectively destroyed the stagnant idea that the world was made of 4 static elements: earth, air, fire, and water, and replaced it with a dynamic world of chemical reactions and transforming substances, creating the mental framework necessary for the scientific revolution. He taught the world that the only way to know the truth was to get your hands dirty, to burn things, distill things, and watch what actually happens, rather than trusting the dusty words of Aristotle or Galen. He introduced the use of specific chemicals for specific diseases, the concept of metabolic illness, and the critical idea of dosage, effectively writing the first draft of modern pharmacology. But perhaps his most enduring legacy is the Paracelsian spirit, the refusal to bow to authority, the courage to be an outsider, and the belief that the potential for healing lies hidden in the most unlikely places, waiting for a bold mind to unlock it. This transition from the mystic to the mechanic was painful and messy, but it was Paracelsus who first lit the fuse, blowing a hole in the wall of medieval ignorance so that the light of science could finally stream in. While Paracelsus is rightly celebrated as the father of modern chemistry and toxicology, there is a whole other side to his genius that often gets swept under the rug by embarrassed historians, yet it is arguably just as revolutionary. He was the grandfather of what we now call energy medicine, and the first scientist to seriously investigate the medical properties of magnetism. In a time when a magnet was seen as a mere curiosity or a navigational tool for sailors, Paracelsus looked at that strange dark stone and saw a potent medical device, reasoning that if a magnet could attract iron, a heavy physical metal, through the invisible medium of air, then it must possess a hidden power that could be harnessed to manipulate the invisible forces within the human body. He famously stated, "The magnet has long lain before all eyes, and yet no one has ever thought whether it was of any use for anything other than the compass." And he proceeded to develop a therapy that involved placing magnets on specific points of the body to draw out pathological fluxes and relieve pain, effectively treating the body's energy field centuries before anyone knew what an electromagnetic field was. This wasn't just mysticism to him, it was consistent with his chemical worldview where, like cures like, and he believed the magnet's attractive power could pull disease out of the system just as it pulled a needle, a concept that would later inspire Franz Mesmer in the 18th century, and eventually evolve into the therapeutic use of magnets and even MRI technology today. But his exploration of the invisible didn't stop at magnets. He developed a complex theory about the sidereal body, or the astral body, arguing that a human being is actually composed of 2 bodies: the elemental body, which is made of the dust of the earth and eats physical food, and the sidereal body, which is made of the essence of the stars and feeds on the invisible impressions of the universe. This was his explanation for human intellect, art, and wisdom, claiming that while our flesh comes from the ground, our mind comes from the cosmos, and therefore mental diseases are star diseases that cannot be treated with earthly herbs but require spiritual medicines. This led him to posit the incredible power of the imaginatio, or the human imagination, which he regarded not as a fantasy factory in the brain, but as a literal physical force that could shape reality. Paracelsus argued that a strong imagination could create disease, what we now call psychosomatic illness, and that a focused, powerful will could cure it, famously stating, "The imagination is the sunshine of the soul. It can cause illness, and it can cure illness," essentially describing the placebo effect and the power of positive thinking 400 years before modern psychology accepted them. He went so far as to warn that a doctor who doubts his own cure will fail because his lack of faith acts as a counterpoison, neutralizing the medicine, while a doctor with a strong, charismatic will can cure a patient simply through his presence, a phenomenon every modern physician knows is true but rarely talks about. He believed that this sidereal body continued to live for a while after physical death, which was his scientific explanation for ghosts and hauntings, describing them not as demons but as the decaying astral shells of people who were too attached to the earth, a theory that became the bedrock of later occultism and theosophy. He also dived into the concept of mumia, in a way that related to this invisible action at a distance, suggesting that if you treated the blood on a bandage, the spirit of that blood was still entangled with the patient, and the healing of the bandage would induce healing in the patient, a bizarre idea that oddly parallels the concept of quantum entanglement, where particles remain connected across space. Paracelsus was trying to map the Wi-Fi of the universe, the invisible network of sympathies and antipathies that connects every living thing, arguing that man is a microcosm, or a little world, because he is an extract from all the stars and planets of the whole firmament, from the earth and the elements, and so he is their quintessence. This meant that to understand a kidney, you had to understand the planet Venus, and to understand the heart, you had to understand the sun, not in a superstitious horoscope way, but in a way that recognized that the same laws of physics and chemistry that form the galaxies also folded the proteins in your blood. He was fighting against the materialism of the Galenists who only looked at the humours, trying to reintroduce the spirit into medicine without resorting to religious dogma, aiming for a spiritual science that respected the mystery of life while still demanding rigorous observation. This holistic approach, where the patient's mind, the doctor's will, the position of the stars, environment, and the chemical drug all had to align for a cure, makes Paracelsus the ultimate pioneer of integrative medicine, teaching us that you cannot just fix a broken machine, because a human being is a galaxy wrapped in skin, pulsed by the same rhythms that drive the universe. To truly understand why Paracelsus was such a threat to the establishment, we have to dive deep into the actual method of his madness, a revolutionary technique he called the spagyric art, a term he invented by smashing together the Greek words spau, to tear apart, and ageiro, to gather together. This wasn't just a fancy name, it was a radical rethinking of how human beings interact with matter, based on the belief that nature in its raw state is imperfect, and that it is the divine duty of the human alchemist to finish what nature started. He used the analogy of bread and wine, pointing out that God gives us wheat and grapes, but it is human ingenuity that transforms them into bread and wine, effectively exalting the raw material into something higher and more useful. Paracelsus applied this same logic to medicine, arguing that raw herbs were full of dross, or impurities that clogged the body and hindered healing, and that the doctor's job was to use fire and chemistry to strip away the useless plant matter, the dead body, to reveal the pure, living soul of the medicine. This is where he applied his famous tria prima theory, mercury, sulfur and salt, in a practical laboratory setting that would make a modern chemist nod in recognition. He believed that every plant or mineral had three components that needed to be separated and purified. The mercury, which was the volatile spirit or alcohol obtained through fermentation, the sulfur, which was the essential oil that carried the specific scent and fiery character of the plant, and the salt, which was the mineral ash left behind after burning the plant matter. His spagyric process involved fermenting the plant to release the spirit, distilling it to capture the oil, and incinerating the leftovers to get the white salts. And then, here is the magic, he would chemically recombine these three purified parts into a super medicine he called an arcanum. This arcanum was considered a resurrected plant, a medicine that had gone through death, burning fermentation, and resurrection, recombination, making it infinitely more potent than the soups and teas prescribed by the Galenic doctors. The apothecaries of his time absolutely hated him for this, because their entire business model relied on polypharmacy, the practice of mixing 50 or 60 different ingredients into one expensive, sludgy concoction called a theriac, which was basically a shotgun approach to medicine. Throw everything at the patient and hope something sticks. Paracelsus mocked these complex recipes as swill for swine, arguing that they just confused the body and instead championed the use of simples, single, potent chemical agents targeted at a specific disease. This was the birth of the silver bullet concept in medicine. The idea that for every specific lock, disease, there is a specific key, chemical compound, a philosophy that leads directly to modern synthetic drugs like antibiotics, where we isolate the active molecule rather than eating the mold. This shift from kitchen cooking to laboratory synthesis terrified the medical guild because it required a skill set they didn't have. They knew how to read Latin books, but they didn't know how to manage a furnace or distill alcohol without blowing themselves up. Paracelsus was effectively trying to professionalize the drug industry, demanding that pharmacists be skilled chemists rather than just merchants, and he was ruthless in exposing their fraud. He would often walk into apothecaries, taste their medicines and spit them out, declaring them to be adulterated or useless, which, as you can imagine, didn't make him many friends among the shopkeepers. But his spagyric philosophy went even deeper than just making pills. It was a spiritual stance. He believed that by purifying matter, the alchemist was also purifying himself, participating in a cosmic drama of redemption. He wrote that the separation of the pure from the impure was the fundamental process of the universe, happening in the stomach when we digest food, in the mind when we discern truth from lies, and in the afterlife when the soul is separated from the body. Thus his laboratory work was a form of prayer, a laborar est orar, to work is to pray, where the clinking of glass beakers was his liturgy. He also introduced the concept of tartar in a new light here, arguing that just as the alchemist separates impurities in the lab, the body tries to do the same, and when the body fails to spagyrically process food, that tartar builds up as stones and gout. This circular logic, that the macrocosm, universe, the microcosm, body, and the lab all follow the same laws of separation and recombination, gave his followers a unified theory of everything, a seductive intellectual framework that promised that if you could master the fire in the furnace, you could master the fire of life itself. He was handing humanity the keys to the engine room of reality, telling us that we aren't just passive victims of nature, but active co-creators who can improve upon God's work. A dangerously empowering idea that helped spark the ambition of the modern scientific age. If you think Paracelsus was just about beakers and mercury, you're missing the wildest part of his resume, because this Swiss scientist is actually the grandfather of modern fantasy literature, and the guy who practically invented the creatures you see in everything from Disney movies to Dungeons and Dragons. In 1566, a book was published posthumously called Liber de Nymphis, Sylphis, Pygmeis, et Salamandris, and in this mind-bending text, Paracelsus categorized the supernatural beings of the four elements, giving us the classification that we still use today. He described the gnomes or pygmies as the spirits of the earth, who could move through solid rock as easily as a fish moves through water, guarding the treasures of the mines. He described the undines or nymphs as the spirits of the water who looked like beautiful humans, the sylphs as the spirits of the air who rode the winds, and the salamanders as the spirits of fire who lived in volcanoes. But here is the tragic poetic twist that inspired Hans Christian Andersen to write The Little Mermaid centuries later. Paracelsus argued that while these elemental beings were long-lived and powerful, they lacked one crucial thing: an immortal soul. He theorized that they were soulless men who would simply dissolve into the elements when they died, like smoke dissipating in the wind, unless, and this is the big Hollywood hook, they married a human being. He believed that if an Undine married a man, she would gain an immortal soul and the chance for salvation, a concept that added a heavy layer of Gothic romance to his scientific worldview. Now, why on earth would a doctor writing about syphilis also write about mermaids? Because to Paracelsus the universe was plenum, meaning it was full. He couldn't accept that God would leave the vast oceans, the deep earth, or the infinite air empty of life, so he filled them with these sagana or elemental spirits, arguing that they were part of the biological reality of nature, just as real as a wolf or an eagle. This wasn't just a fairy tale to him, it was an attempt to classify the invisible biology of the cosmos, suggesting that intelligence wasn't limited to humans. This work on elementals made him a hero to the German Romantics and the later occultists, but Paracelsus didn't stop at categorizing spirits. He also dabbled in the dangerous game of political prophecy. He wrote a series of 32 prognostications, cryptic symbolic cartoons and predictions about the future of Europe, which were so popular that they were reprinted more often than his medical books during his lifetime. In these strange pamphlets he predicted the fall of the red, the Catholic hierarchy, and the rise of a yellow lion, interpreted by some as a golden age of alchemy or a Germanic emperor, using a visual language of roses, stars and swords that would later become the core imagery of the Rosicrucians, a secret society that claimed Paracelsus as their spiritual prophet. He spoke of an Elias Artista, a messianic figure who would come in the future to reveal the final secrets of alchemy and turn the world into a paradise, a prophecy that kept alchemists working in their labs for centuries, convinced that they were preparing the way for this scientific saviour. Paracelsus was effectively building a mythology around science, turning the laboratory into a temple where the future of mankind was being forged. He also introduced the concept of the astral light, a shimmering invisible medium that connects all minds, which he believed explained phenomena like telepathy and prophecy. He argued that a prophet doesn't speak to God directly, but reads the stars within the astral light, effectively describing a universal collective consciousness. This mix of hard chemistry, zinc, mercury, laudanum, and high fantasy, gnomes, astral travel, prophecies, is what makes Paracelsus such a baffling figure to modern biographers who want to put him in a neat box. Was he a scientist? Yes. Was he a mystic? Yes. To Paracelsus there was no difference. Studying a rock and studying a ghost were both ways of understanding God's creation. He famously said, "Thoughts are free and are subject to no rule. On them rests the freedom of man," a declaration of intellectual independence that scared the church because it meant that a man's mind was his own kingdom, uncontrolled by dogmas. His writings on the elementals and the astral plane were not the ramblings of a madman, but the creative explosions of a mind that saw the universe as a magical machine, where every gear and lever, visible or invisible, had a purpose. He taught that we are surrounded by intelligence, that the world is watching us, and that the doctor must respect the invisible people just as much as the visible patients, expanding the scope of medicine to include the supernatural ecosystem that he believed we all live in. If you dig deep into the secret history of Europe, you will eventually hit a wall of mystery known as the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, a strange period in the early 1600s when anonymous manifestos appeared promising a universal reformation of mankind. And guess who was listed as the spiritual godfather of this invisible brotherhood? None other than our Swiss rebel, Paracelsus. The Rosicrucian texts, specifically the Fama Fraternitatis, explicitly revered Paracelsus, calling him a man of noble and high-piercing spirit who had cracked the code of nature, even though they admitted he was a bit too rough around the edges for their polite society. This connection isn't just a footnote. It confirms that Paracelsus had become the symbol of the counterculture of the Renaissance. the hero for everyone who wanted to overthrow the stagnant authority of the Pope and the old universities. He was the Luther of medicine, a title he both loved and hated, because while Luther reformed the Church, Paracelsus wanted to reform the very fabric of reality, arguing that the book of nature was open to everyone, not just the priests in ivory towers. This populist attitude is nowhere more evident than in his war against the piss prophets, the nickname he gave to the doctors who claimed to diagnose every disease simply by looking at a flask of the patient's urine. In the 16th century, uroscopy was the gold standard of diagnosis. A doctor would hold a glass of urine up to the light, swirl it around, look at the colour, and pronounce a verdict, often charging a fortune for this visual inspection. Paracelsus thought this was absolute garbage, a scam designed to cheat the ignorant. He argued that you can't know what is in the liquid just by looking at it, famously shouting, "You cannot judge the wine by looking at the bottle." Instead, he introduced chemical uroscopy, where he would take the urine to his lab, distill it, add acids to it to see how it reacted, and weigh the sediments, effectively inventing the field of clinical pathology. He was looking for chemical markers of disease, measuring the amount of tartar or salt to determine if the kidneys were failing, shifting diagnosis from an art of guessing to a science of measuring. This was a massive paradigm shift because it demanded that the doctor actually do something, that he get his hands dirty with bodily fluids and acids, rather than just standing there looking dignified in a velvet robe. It also democratized medicine because chemical reactions don't lie. They don't care if the patient is a king or a peasant. The reaction is the same, which fit perfectly with Paracelsus's radical social views. He was one of the first to argue that the poor deserved the same quality of care as the rich, a dangerous idea in a feudal society where the life of a serf was worth less than a hunting dog. He often treated peasants for free, taking his payment in bread or wine, and he viciously attacked the greed of the medical guild, writing, "If you want to be a true physician, you must not be a greedy hypocrite. You must love the sick more than your purse." This attitude made him a folk hero among the common people, who saw him as a magician who was on their side, a Gandalf-like figure who used his powers to heal the weak and mock the powerful. His followers, the Paracelsians, carried this torch of medical democracy forward, often becoming involved in political revolutions, arguing that if the hierarchy of the body could be cured by chemistry, then the hierarchy of the state could be cured by reform. This is why the chemical medicine of Paracelsus was often banned by kings and bishops. They understood that it wasn't just about pills, it was about authority. If you accepted Paracelsus, you accepted that truth comes from experiment and individual experience, not from the decree of an ancient book or a crowned head. He was planting the seeds of the Enlightenment, the idea that nullius in verba, take nobody's word for it, which would later become the motto of the Royal Society. He was teaching the world to question everything, to test every claim in the fire of the laboratory, and this critical spirit is his true legacy, far more valuable than any specific recipe for gold or elixir. He was the first modern scientist because he was the first to realise that science is a rebellion against the way things have always been done, a constant aggressive search for a better way, driven by the belief that the universe is a puzzle that God wants us to solve, not a mystery we are forbidden to touch. While Paracelsus spent much of his life fighting diseases, his ultimate obsession was far more ambitious than just curing a fever or setting a bone. He was chasing the holy grail of alchemy known as the ens longa vitae, or the essence of long life. He didn't just want to fix the body, he wanted to perfect it, believing that the human lifespan had been shortened by the fall of man and that chemical science could reverse the clock, potentially allowing humans to live for centuries like the biblical patriarchs. This brings us to one of the most famous and bizarre legends associated with his name, the primum ens melissae, or the first essence of lemon balm. Paracelsus claimed that this specific preparation, involving the fermentation of the melissa plant in potassium carbonate and alcohol, contained a concentrated rejuvenating force so powerful it could literally renew youth. A later story, often cited by his followers to prove his genius, tells of a French physician who found Paracelsus's recipe and tested it on an old decrepit chicken. After a few drops of the elixir, the chicken supposedly lost its ragged feathers and grew fresh, bright plumage, and when the doctor tried it on an elderly woman, she reportedly began to menstruate again and grew new teeth. A tale that sounds like pure science fiction, but illustrates the absolute faith his disciples had in his chemical mastery. Paracelsus believed that death is nothing but the separation of the soul from the body, and that if you could strengthen the bond between the two using the tinctures of gold and precious stones, you could delay that separation indefinitely. This led him to the pursuit of aurum potabile, or drinkable gold. In the alchemical worldview, gold was the only immortal metal because it never rusted, never tarnished, and couldn't be destroyed by fire or acid, except aqua regia. Therefore Paracelsus reasoned that if you could make gold liquid and ingest it without it killing you, it would transfer that quality of immortality to your flesh. He spent years trying to create a red oil of gold, distinct from the toxic mercury cures, arguing that this was the medicine of the sun, capable of strengthening the heart and the vital spirit. This wasn't just greed, it was a coherent medical theory based on the idea of incorruptibility. If the body's destroyed by corruption, rot, disease, then introducing an incorruptible substance like gold should logically halt the process. But he didn't stop at gold. He also searched for the legendary Alchemist, a theoretical universal solvent that could dissolve any substance on Earth into its primordial liquid state. The logic was that if you could dissolve a substance completely, you could reduce it to its materia prima, or first matter, stripping away all impurities and leaving only the pure divine essence. Paracelsus believed that the Alchemist was the key to unlocking the true medicine hidden inside even the hardest stones, and while he probably never found it, since a liquid that dissolves everything would also dissolve the bottle you keep it in, the search for it drove the development of stronger and stronger acids, pushing the boundaries of chemical knowledge. He organised his medical treatments into a hierarchy that is fascinatingly similar to modern gaming levels. At the bottom were elementary medicines, raw herbs, diet, which were weak. Above them were specifics, extracts for specific organs. And at the very top were the arcana, the secret high-power chemical weapons that acted directly on the spiritual roots of life. He defined 4 supreme arcana: the arcanum of the first matter, the arcanum of the stone, the arcanum of the mercury of life, and the arcanum of the tincture. These weren't just drugs. They were nuclear options for the body, designed to purge the deepest evils of disease. He wrote that the arcanum is the whole virtue of a thing. It has the power to restore the old to youth and the sick to health, essentially describing what we today might call stem cell therapy or genetic engineering, a fundamental reset of the biological system. Paracelsus was arguably the first biohacker, a man who refused to accept the biological limits of the human body as fixed, constantly experimenting with dangerous compounds in his own body to see if he could upgrade his physiology. He looked at the aging process not as a natural law, but as a disease to be cured, a rusting of the body's machinery that could be polished clean with the right chemical solvents. This Promethean attitude, that we can steal the fire of the gods to remake ourselves, is the core of the Paracelsian legacy. He taught us that nature is not a museum to be admired, but a workshop to be used, and that the light of nature gives us the permission to tweak the design. His work on longevity, while filled with exaggerations and failures, planted the idea that science could extend life, an idea that drives the multi-billion-dollar anti-aging industry today. Every time someone takes a resveratrol supplement or researches telomere extension, they are walking on the path that Paracelsus cut through the dark forest of medieval resignation, holding his lantern of primum ens and promising that we don't have to go gently into that good night. At the very heart of Paracelsus's medical philosophy lay a concept that was so advanced it practically predicted the discovery of enzymes and gastric juices, a concept he named the archeus, which he described as an internal alchemist residing in the stomach, a tireless director of the body's operations. Paracelsus argued that when we eat a piece of bread or meat, it is dead matter that is potentially poisonous to us unless it is transformed, and it is the job of the archaeist to separate the poison, the waste, from the essence, the nutrient, a chemical sorting process that keeps us alive. He believed that when the archaeist becomes drunk or weakened by bad habits, stress, or age, it fails to separate the waste properly, allowing the tartar, that sludgy, calcified residue we discussed earlier, to slip into the bloodstream and deposit itself in the joints and arteries, creating the first coherent theory of metabolic dysfunction. But his genius went even further with the introduction of the semina morbi, or the seeds of disease, a theory that completely shattered the Galenic idea that illness was just a fluid imbalance. Paracelsus looked at the world and saw that nature produces specific seeds that grow into specific plants. An apple seed always becomes an apple tree, never a pear tree. And he reasoned that diseases must follow the exact same law of nature. He argued that a disease is not a vague state of being unwell, but a specific parasitic entity with its own life cycle, its own seed, and its own anatomy, which invades the body and grows like a weed in a garden. This was the ontological view of disease, the radical idea that a sickness is a thing that exists independently of the patient, effectively predicting the existence of bacteria and viruses centuries before the microscope confirmed them. Because he believed disease was a specific seed, he insisted that it required a specific poison to kill it, contradicting the doctors of his time who treated everything with the same generic bloodletting and purging. Paracelsus demanded arcana, specific chemical weapons targeted at the specific invader. This led him to formulate the primitive version of the principle similia similibus curantur, or like cures like. The idea that a substance which causes symptoms in a healthy person can cure those same symptoms in a sick person, if given in the right dose. For example, if a certain poison causes vomiting and fever, a tiny alchemically prepared dose of that same poison might cure a fever, a concept that became the foundation of homeopathy 300 years later, although Paracelsus used much stronger material doses than modern homeopaths. He viewed the body as a battlefield where the internal physician, the immune system archaeus, fought against the external enemy, the disease seed, and the doctor's only job was to supply the internal physician with weapons, medicine, and then get out of the way. He wrote, "Nature is the physician, not you. The physician is just the servant of nature," a humble admission that often got lost in his arrogant shouting matches, but which underpinned his entire practice. He also expanded his chemical worldview to include the mysterium magnum, the great mystery, arguing that everything in the physical world is condensed spirit, and that by manipulating the physical, we manipulate the spiritual. This is why he was so obsessed with antimony, a toxic metalloid that he purified into a red oil, believing it had the power to purge the body of impure gold or toxins. He called it the wolf of metals, because it devoured everything it touched, just as it would devour the disease. His detailed recipes for antimonial wine that had been allowed to sit in an antimony cup, became a staple of European medicine for centuries, used to induce sweating and vomiting to shock the system back into alignment. It was dangerous, yes, and likely killed some patients if the dosage was wrong, but it was also undeniably effective in acute cases where herbal teas did nothing, proving that in the war against death, Paracelsus was willing to use heavy artillery. He was effectively turning medicine from a gardening club into a military operation, equipping doctors with the chemical firepower to intervene in the life and death struggles of the body. And while his theories on the archaeus and seminar were mocked by the university elites who preferred their ancient books, they laid the unspoken groundwork for the entire field of infectious disease and immunology that would eventually save billions of lives. To fully grasp the magnitude of the Paracelsian revolution, we have to look at how he completely rewrote the story of Genesis, effectively turning the Bible into a chemistry textbook and God into the ultimate alchemist, a theological move that gave his followers the moral high ground to ignore the Pope and the universities. Paracelsus argued that the creation of the world was not a magical conjuring trick, but a specific chemical separation process where God, the grand archeus, took the mysterium magnum, the primordial chaos, and chemically separated the light from the darkness, the waters from the dry land, and the firmament from the earth. This was a mind-blowing concept because it implied that the entire universe was the product of a massive alchemical reaction that was still ongoing, and therefore the alchemist in his laboratory was not just a guy boiling pea in a pot, but a priest reenacting the divine work of creation on a smaller scale. This concept, known as the chemical philosophy, became the rallying cry for a generation of scientists who felt that by studying matter, they were studying the very mind of God, effectively bridging the gap between religion and science in a way that allowed research to flourish without being branded as heresy. It was this spiritual confidence that emboldened his followers, like Oswald Kroll and Gerhard Dorn, to storm the gates of the establishment in the late 16th century, publishing massive textbooks that systematized Paracelsus's chaotic scribblings into a coherent chemical medicine that directly challenged the authority of Aristotle. For 2,000 years, Aristotle's logic had ruled the world. If Aristotle said heavier objects fall faster, then they do, regardless of what you see. But Paracelsus screamed that logic was useless for understanding nature because nature doesn't care about your syllogisms. Nature only cares about fire. He famously stated, "The fire is the test. What the fire separates, that is the truth," shifting the entire basis of human knowledge from thinking about things to testing things. This was the death knell of the armchair philosopher and the birth of the experimental scientist. This shift is nowhere more visible than in the changing definition of element. Before Paracelsus, an element, earth, air, fire, water, was a quality, hot, cold, wet, dry. After Paracelsus, and through the work of his followers leading up to Robert Boyle, who was a closet Paracelsian, an element became a substance, something that cannot be chemically broken down further. This is the direct ancestor of the periodic table. Paracelsus's tria prima, mercury, sulfur, salt, might sound archaic today, but it was the necessary stepping stone that moved science away from vague qualities to concrete substances. He taught us to look for the salt, the solid, the sulfur, the flammable oil, and the mercury, the volatile spirit in everything, forcing chemists to analyze the composition of matter rather than just its appearance. Furthermore, his insistence on the light of nature as a second revelation meant that pagans and indigenous people could possess medical truth just as much as Christians, a radical inclusivity that led his followers to eagerly study the heathen remedies from the New World, like tobacco and Peruvian bark, quinine. While the traditional doctors at the University of Paris were debating whether it was sinful to use a drug discovered by savages, the Paracelsian doctors were already curing malaria with quinine and using tobacco smoke for enemas. A bad idea, but hey, they were experimenting, proving that results mattered more than dogma. This pragmatic, results-oriented approach terrified the Church because it suggested that the truth was out there in the world, waiting to be found by anyone with a furnace and a curious mind, rather than being locked up in the Vatican Library. Paracelsus effectively democratized the truth, handing the keys of the universe to the common man and saying, "Here, cook this and see what happens." He also introduced the concept of the homogeneity of the cosmos, meaning the stuff in the stars is the same stuff in your blood, which killed the medieval idea that the heavens were made of some perfect, unchanging fifth element, quintessence, that was totally different from earthly matter. By bringing the heavens down to earth and raising the earth to the heavens, he smashed the crystal spheres of ancient astronomy and paved the way for the physics of Newton, who would later prove that the gravity holding the moon is the same gravity dropping the apple. By the time the 17th century rolled around, the sheer weight of Paracelsus's medical victories forced the establishment to surrender, but they did it in a very sneaky way. They accepted his medicines but rejected his philosophy, creating a chemical compromise that defines modern healthcare to this day. The turning point came in 1618 with the publication of the Pharmacopoeia Londinensis by the Royal College of Physicians, a massive government-sanctioned drug book that, for the first time in history, included a dedicated section on chemical medicines alongside the traditional herbal ones. This was the official moment when the medical world admitted that Theophrastus the madman was right, acknowledging that sometimes a patient needs a chemically prepared metal, not just a root or a leaf to survive. However, while they adopted his mercury, antimony and laudanum, the emerging scientists of the Enlightenment, like Robert Boyle and Antoine Lavoisier, worked hard to scrub away the magical parts of his work, stripping out the gnomes, the archaeus, and the astral light to create a sanitized, purely materialist chemistry. They loved the spagyric separation of molecules but hated the astrological connection to the stars, effectively severing the link between the patient's soul and the doctor's prescription, which is why today your doctor will give you an antibiotic but won't ask you about your spiritual state or the phase of the moon. Yet, despite this sanitization, Paracelsus remains the undisputed father of chemotherapy, a word that literally means chemical treatment. When you look at how we treat cancer today, using highly toxic, carefully dosed poisons to kill a rapidly growing seed of disease, while trying to spare the patient, you're looking at pure Paracelsian medicine. He was the first to suggest that arsenic, a deadly poison, could be used to treat illnesses, a radical idea that eventually led to Paul Ehrlich's discovery of Salvecin, the magic bullet for syphilis, and the modern use of arsenic trioxide to treat certain types of leukemia. He also made groundbreaking observations on endemic goiter and cretinism in the Salzburg region, correctly identifying that the deformities and mental delays seen in the local population were not caused by genetic inferiority or God's wrath, but by the water they were drinking, specifically a lack of certain minerals, which we now know is iodine. This was an incredible act of medical geography, linking public health directly to the environment and geology, proving that the Earth itself dictates the health of the people living on it. But his influence wasn't limited to science. It bled deeply into the culture, arguably serving as the real-life inspiration for the legend of Faust, the scholar who strives for infinite knowledge and power. The German writer Goethe, who wrote the most famous version of Faust, was an avid student of alchemy and Paracelsus, and it is easy to see the reflection of the Swiss doctor in the character of Faust, a man who burns his books, rejects the dusty universities, and turns to magic and nature to find the secrets of the universe. Paracelsus was the archetype of the romantic genius, the solitary figure standing on a mountaintop fighting against a corrupt system, a narrative that fueled the romantic movement in art and literature. He represented the Promethean spirit of science, the dangerous but necessary drive to steal fire from the gods to help mankind, acknowledging that knowledge always comes with a price. Even his sword, Azoth, became a mythical object in literature, a symbol of the double-edged nature of technology. It can save you, or it can damn you, depending on the heart of the wielder. As the scientific revolution gained speed, Paracelsus became a polarizing figure. To the rationalists, he was a superstitious, embarrassing uncle who believed in fairies, but to the mystics and the early psychologists like Carl Jung, he was a visionary who understood the deep connection between the human unconscious and the physical world. Jung later wrote extensively about Paracelsus, crediting him with being the first to recognize the psychological aspect of healing, seeing the alchemical process not just as turning lead into gold, but as a metaphor for individuation, the psychological process of becoming a whole, integrated human being. Thus, Paracelsus managed to be the father of both modern pharmacology and modern depth psychology, a dual legacy that no other scientist in history can claim, straddling the divide between the pill and the psyche, the beaker and the dream, reminding us that we are amphibious creatures living in both a world of hard matter and a world of invisible meaning. As we approach the end of this journey, we must pause to appreciate the sheer magnitude of Paracelsus's personality and his personal motto, a phrase that deserves to be tattooed on the soul of every free thinker: Alterius non sit qui sus esse potest, which translates to "let no man belong to another who can belong to himself." This wasn't just a catchy slogan, it was a radical declaration of independence in an era of feudal servitude, asserting that true knowledge and true health require absolute freedom from the shackles of authority, whether that authority is a king, a pope, or a university dean. It is this fierce individualism that makes him such a uniquely modern figure, arguably the first American spirit long before the United States existed, embodying the rugged belief that one man with the truth is a majority. His influence curiously split into two completely opposite rivers that flow through our culture today. On one bank you have the river of hard science, where his chemical methods led to the pharmaceutical industry, chemotherapy and toxicology, and on the other bank you have the river of alternative medicine, where his theories on the vital force, homeopathy, and natural healing flourish. It is a supreme irony that Samuel Hahnemann, the founder of homeopathy in the late 18th century, publicly denounced Paracelsus, calling him a madman to distance himself from the stigma of alchemy. Yet Hahnemann's core principle of similia similibus curentur, like cures like, was lifted directly from the pages of the Swiss doctor's Opus Paramerum. Paracelsus had argued centuries earlier that what makes a man ill also cures him, using the example that a small dose of a fever-inducing substance can cure a fever, effectively making him the ghostwriter of homeopathy. Simultaneously, the allopathic or conventional doctors adopted his metallic cures, mercury, arsenic, iron and sulphur, which became the standard heroic medicine of the Victorian age. So, whether you're taking a high-tech synthetic drug or a holistic herbal tincture, you are, unknowingly, a disciple of Paracelsus. He is the common ancestor that both sides of the medical war share but refuse to acknowledge. He also predicted the future of placebo studies by insisting that the character of the doctor was a medical instrument in itself, stating that the patient should have faith in his physician, for the compassion of the physician is the best medicine, recognizing that the bond of trust between healer and sick person releases the internal alchemist to do the work of repair. This humanistic approach was lost for a long time during the industrialization of medicine, where patients became broken cars on an assembly line, but it is now making a massive comeback in the form of patient-centered care. Paracelsus also had a profound impact on the study of latent diseases, observing that a person can be healthy today, but carry the seed of a disease that will only bloom years later, a concept that perfectly describes conditions like cancer or genetic disorders that lie dormant until triggered by environmental factors. He warned that the womb of the world is full of the seeds of all diseases, a terrifying but accurate assessment of our biological reality. Furthermore, his relentless output of writing, estimated over 10,000 pages of medical, theological and philosophical text, was a feat of endurance that baffles historians, especially considering he was constantly travelling, treating patients, and allegedly drinking heavily. He dictated his works to scribes at a furious pace, often without notes, driven by a manic need to save the knowledge he had gathered before his time ran out. He knew he was hated, he knew he was in danger, but he also knew he was right. In one of his most defiant moments he wrote, "I know that the monarchy of the mind will belong to me, that the glory will be mine. I do not praise myself, but nature praises me, for I am born of nature and follow her path." This wasn't arrogance, it was a prophecy. He saw a future where medicine would stop quoting Aristotle and start reading the blood and the stars, a future where we would unlock the secrets of the atom to cure the body. He even foresaw the chemical wedding of the microscopic and the macroscopic, the realization that the laws that govern the motion of the planets are the same laws that govern the circulation of the blood. As we look at his Portrait of the Artist as a young dog, we see a man who was willing to be wrong, willing to be ridiculed, and willing to be poor, all for the sake of the light of nature. He was the original disruptor, the Silicon Valley entrepreneur of the 16th century, who broke the monopoly of the old guilds to launch a startup called Modern Science. And while his software was full of bugs, gnomes, homunculi, weapon salve. His operating system is the one we are still running today. In the quiet graveyard of St. Sebastian in Salzburg stands a modest monument with an inscription that reads, "Here lies Philippus Theophrastus, who cured those wounds, leprosy, gout, dropsy, and other incurable diseases of the body with wonderful art, and gave his goods to be distributed to the poor." It is a deceptively peaceful ending for a man whose life was a hurricane of noise, conflict, and revolution. But the true monument to Paracelsus isn't made of stone. It is built into the very foundations of the civilized world we live in today. Every time you walk into a pharmacy to pick up a prescription, you are walking into the temple of Paracelsus. Every time a surgeon washes their hands to prevent infection, ignoring the old dogma of laudable pus, they are honouring his legacy. Every time a toxicologist measures a dose in parts per million to determine safety, they're using the ruler that he carved. He was the first human being to fully realise that the body is a chemical system that can be understood, repaired, and optimised, effectively breaking the spell of magic and fatalism that had held humanity hostage for 1,000 years. But his legacy is not just about the pills or the chemistry, it is about the attitude. Paracelsus is the eternal patron saint of the outsider, the historical reminder that the experts can be wrong, that the consensus is often just a fortress of shared ignorance, and that the truth usually wears a rough coat and smells of sulphur rather than expensive perfume. He taught us that science is not a static list of facts to be memorized from a dusty book, but a dynamic, dangerous, and beautiful quest into the unknown, a hunt for the secrets that God has hidden in the stars, the stones, and the plants. He proved that one man with the light of nature in his eyes is more powerful than 1,000 professors in velvet robes repeating the same old lies. As we stand in the 21st century, facing our own terrifying medical crises, from antibiotic resistance to global pandemics, the ghost of Paracelsus looms larger than ever, urging us to look beyond the textbooks, to experiment without fear, and to remember that the ultimate cure is not just in the molecule, but in the love and compassion of the physician. He was a living bridge between two worlds, standing with one foot in the medieval mist of demons, gnomes, and magic, and the other foot on the solid ground of modern chemistry and empirical observation, and by sheer force of will, he pulled humanity across that bridge into the modern age. There are old legends in Austria that say Paracelsus never actually died, that he discovered the Elixir of Life in his final days and simply faked his death to escape the persecution of his enemies, continuing to wander the world under different names, still testing, still healing, still searching for the ultimate alchemical wedding of matter and spirit. Whether or not he is physically walking the earth, his spirit is undeniably alive in the curiosity of every child who asks why, in the bravery of every researcher who challenges the status quo, and in the hope of every patient who refuses to give up when the doctors say there is no hope. He was the alchemist who turned the lead of ignorance into the gold of knowledge, not by magic, but by work, suffering, and an unshakable belief in the power of nature. So, the next time you see the symbol of medicine, or take a simple aspirin for a headache, remember the stormy, sword-wielding Swiss doctor who stood alone against the world and screamed that the truth was burning in the fire, waiting for us to find it. Thanks for joining me on this wild journey into the life of the most controversial scientist in history. And remember, as Paracelsus himself said, the art of healing comes from nature, not from the physician. Therefore the physician must start from nature with an open mind.